there's very few times in our adult lives where another adult gives you a pen and some paper or a marker and some newspapers and says, you got 10 minutes, make me something.
Mm-hmm.
And I am just always blown away whenever a group of adults does Blackout poetry. The results are amazing. You see people, you see that concentration that comes on their faces. They look like kids again. Kids when they're playing, people think, oh, kids playing, what a great thing. No, kids are intensely serious when they're playing. Like my son gets so frustrated and kind of zoomed in to what he's doing when he's playing. Sometimes you wonder, like, is he torturing himself? But he takes his play so seriously. He has this look of concentration when he's like pushing his cars around and stuff. And adults get that same look on their face, like when they're doing the Blackout poems. And it's probably like doing a crossword or something, but they get this in this zone of concentration. And then when they're done making the poems, they'll share them. That's the thing that really blows my mind, because like if you asked a bunch of adults to write you a poem, they would like freeze up and no one would do anything. And at the end, there might be a few like exhibitionists that would get up and read something that they'd written, but most people would stay silent. But because you're taking other people's words and you're just playing and you're destroying and, doing this kind of almost non-serious activity, even though people get really into it, they feel free up, like the things that they made were no big deal and they'll read them and it's kind of funny. But the power of that, just like giving people that reign again to just, hey, make us something, and taking the stakes out of it,
Mm-hmm.
like it doesn't have to be good. You just do something, that if you experience that as an adult and you haven't experienced it in 20 years, it's really powerful.
I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com. Austin, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I have been a longtime fan of your work, have kept up with it for a really long time, and you've also been requested by many, many of our listeners for all the years that we've run this show. So I'm really thrilled that you're finally here. And on that note, can you tell us a bit about your story, your journey, your background, and how that has brought you to what you're up to and the work that you're doing in the world today?
I grew up like a lot of people. I grew up drawing and writing, and I just sort of never stopped. I feel like a lot of times when you talk to artists and writers, a lot of kids make pictures, and a lot of kids tell stories, and a lot of kids are interested in art. And I really believe that, it's really the ones that don't stop that keep going. That sounds simplistic, but I always wanted to be like an author. I always loved reading. I always, wanted to be someone who had their name on the bookshelves,
Mm-hmm.
But I just figured it would never happen. Like I went to, I just had pretty low expectations for everything. So I kind of, I went to college and had some really good teachers, and they all told me like, look, you'll never make a living as a writer, figure something else out, get a day job and keep working on your stuff and cross your fingers. And so I kind of had this career where I was a librarian for a while. I then became a web designer, and then I ended up a copywriter and ad agency. And kind of during that whole period, I was blogging and writing and drawing and just kind of putting my stuff out there. And I had put a book out in 2010 that was an art poetry book called Newspaper Blackout, which has a bunch of my newspaper blackouts. They look like if the CIA did haiku. Basically, they're like, I take a newspaper article and I black out most of the words and just leave a few of them behind. And so that came out. It's a poetry book, so it's not like I quit my day job or anything. And but the thing that really hit for me was I gave a talk called How to Steal Like an Artist at a community college in upstate New York while I was a copywriter. And that just kind of took off and went viral. And it became clear that that was, people wanted that in a book form. They wanted something that they could buy and give to people, so it just presented itself as my next book, and I sold that, and my publisher Workman wanted me to go on book tour, and my ad agency was up for sale, and they didn't really want me to take 2 months off, so I just quit my job and went on the road. And then Steal Like an Artist did really well, and now that's my life. I draw pictures and write words and put them in books, basically. So my last book came out last year in March, and it's called Show Your Work, and it's kind of a follow-up to Steal Like an Artist. Sorry, that was kind of long-winded.
No, not at all.
Back through the story. Yeah, I don't know. I'm someone who, I kind of want to go back to that point. Like, I just figured this would never happen for me. And that's something that I've always kind of, I don't know. I talk to a lot. The one point that I always make in my books that people really seem to push back against is don't quit your day job. And my thing with that is, before you can do what you love, you kind of need you need to make sure what loves you back. There's kind of this Venn diagram between what you love and what loves you back, and whatever that overlap is probably where you can make a living. And so the model I kind of like is keep your day job and then build like a prototype while you're working, like see if you can get a side hustle going. And then once your side hustle takes off, you might be able to make it into your day job. But I think the thing that people forget about turning a side project or a passion into your profession is that you always have a day job. Like there's always an unsexy part of any kind of work. And so I think people have this idea that they can, turn their creative passions or their dreams or whatever into their breadwinning. And that can happen for sure, but you just have to be careful because once you kind of turn your passion, once you turn what keeps you alive into something that literally keeps you alive, things can get a little tricky. But
well, there's so much here that I.
Sorry, yeah. I mean, that was so much. Like, it's like, tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, there's a reason I asked such an open-ended question because it leads to so many other questions. I really want to go back to the very, very beginning of this, and I want to talk about your younger years in a bit more depth, and find out, what kinds of childhood influences did you have? What was it like growing up that would lead you to be this kid who was constantly drawing? Like, what kept you doing that?
Well, I had a really good mom. That helps. I had a mom who, my mom was she was a home ec teacher for a while, and then she became a guidance counselor, and finally she became a high school principal. And so she's, spent her life dedicated to education. And I'm my mom's only child, which won't surprise anyone who's ever met me, unfortunately. But, my mom was always like, what I remember is she had very scheduled, art activity time, like she would sit me down at the kitchen table with Play-Doh or crayons and paper and say, hey, draw me something, make me something, while she cooked dinner, and then I'd make something. She'd say, this looks great, let's put it on the refrigerator. And that's pretty much what I still do. It's like you schedule some time and you have a place, and then you have materials, and that's pretty much what making stuff is about, And so a lot of times when I go out to my studio, it's like I'll come out here, this is the kitchen table, and the Times just whatever I've got in the day, and then mom's refrigerator is like my blog or Instagram or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
So I trace that back to I trace a lot of what I do back to my mom and that encouragement. And I should note that my dad was also sort of into in education, and he's a really creative guy, but he never really had a real good outlet or a really, really good education. Mm-hmm. And so the one thing that, my parents always, I never really saw my parents sitting around reading books, but we always had like 2 newspapers that came every day, and like we always subscribed to like Newsweek and a few magazines, and so there was always this kind of influx of paper and words coming in, and then the one thing that was kind of formative for me was just reading. I mean, my parents read to me every night, and we went to I grew up in this super small town in Ohio, and the public library was just like this beacon of, culture. And so we would go to the library every week and get a big stack of books. And then when I got older, I would go to the mall with my mom. And the mall was like up in Columbus, which is about 30 or 40 minutes away from where we lived. And so there was a Walden Books there. There wasn't a bookstore in my small town. So my mom would buy me a book every time we went to the mall, and then I would follow her around reading the book while she like looked at clothes and whatever. So that was like my little bribe. Mm-hmm. And I spent a lot of time reading that way. And so, that was kind of how it started. Anyways, lots of reading, and then lots of kind of scheduled artsy time.
So, it's interesting. You grew up, being raised by an educator, which makes me want to talk a little bit about education in the modern world and, what your thoughts are on the way we're educating people today. What are the challenges with it? And, what kinds of skills are we missing, and where are we missing the boat in education? Having been raised by somebody who is, part of a system that is clearly now broken, I'm really interested in hearing your perspective from your career and the life that you've had on education today.
Well, I mean, the problem for me when you're talking about this stuff is my personality type is incredibly well suited to navigating the current educational system as it stands. Like, I grew up, I'm extremely extroverted. I'm a book learner. I love to argue, so like there are things in my makeup that school was very easy for me. It was always very easy for me. I can retain, I'm pretty good at like retaining knowledge and spitting it back out. So I'm great on tests. I'm really good under pressure. There's this kind of like bag of influences that makes me like really good at school. So, I mean, like I was valedictorian in my high school. I went to college on a full scholarship, that whole deal. But what I soon found out is like, I'm a box check, I turned around. I was like, I was like 20, 21 years old. And I realized I'm a box checker. I became someone who was just, I was kind of one of those people who was just achieving in order to please the authority figures in my life, which probably sounds kind of crazy considering what I do now.
Yeah.
But, I turned around and I realized that like, so much of my achievements in school and what I'd been up to was about, pleasing my parents, or like, it got to a point where I was pleasing my professors. I mean, I had some really good professors in college, and I started writing to please them, and I had one really good professor in college that told me, don't go to grad school. He said, if you want to be a writer, he's like, go get a job somewhere and just write and see if you still want to do it in a couple of years. And then you can go back to grad school or whatever, because he was talking about like going to an MFA program or something. And so then this really interesting thing happened where I got out of school and I realized like, wow, up until that point, people who were reading my writing were either getting paid to read it, like my professors, or my fellow students were paying to read it, And so there was like this artificial structure. And once I got out of school, I realized like no one gives a crap about me or what I think or what I write. And that was terrifying, but also liberating in this really interesting way, because when I was in creative writing workshops and stuff, they're like, hey, look, here's all these literary journals and you can, submit to these and they, this is how you get your work out there. And I've always kind of hated literary journals, and the reason is I'm not really a fiction writer. I mean, that's one thing I realized is that, when you go to college, they teach you to either write like poetry or fiction, and I realized I'm not really a fiction writer. And anyway, once I got out of school, then it was like, well, you could do anything now. So what are you going to do? And that's when I really discovered drawing again, because I'd kind of suppressed drawing when I was in college. I kind of felt like, writing was the more serious subject than art. And so once I got out of school, it's like, well, what are you going to do? So what I started doing was I started doing those dumb Blackout poems that I mentioned earlier, and say dumb because I really thought they were dumb when I started making them. I really thought like, oh my God, like I'm out of school now and like this is what it's come to. Like I'm making poetry out of the newspaper, But I got kind of stuck on them, and when I posted them to my blog, people just immediately responded to them. They said, wow, this is, and it was the encouragement from other people that kind of kept me making them. And then of course, I started blogging and getting interested in it. So anyway, the point of all this is it really wasn't until I left school and I was out of that structure that I found my really good work. And I'm not saying that school, I loved college. I loved the art. I love going to the library and just reading a stack of books, I loved college. But when I think back on it, I still use stuff that I learned, but it's kind of like one of those, I don't know, old kung fu movies or something where it's like you have to unlearn what you have learned, or maybe that's a Yoda quote. I don't know. But like, it's like you really have to kind of get rid of if you want to do really exciting kind of forward thinking work, like you almost have to like shrug off what you've learned and kind of go into unmarked territory where you're not sure whether you're going to get approval or praise or anything like that, but as far as my current, I just think school is too expensive. I mean, that to me is the big issue in modern education is, there's so much wrong with, but to me, it's really the cost. I mean, especially in higher ed. I went to school for free and I was able to study whatever I wanted to. And I studied abroad and had all sorts of good experiences on the college's dime. And I wish everyone had that opportunity because, it just opened up worlds to me. But the thing that, I think back on my college experience now, the only reason I had those scholarships was because I jumped through so many hoops when I was in high school. My mom and I would actually sit down and plot out, like, here's how you could get, at that point in time, you could get over a 4.0 in a class for taking an AP class. So my mom and I figured out, hey, if you take all these AP classes, you can bump your grade point above like a 4, basically, and so because she had access to that system, like we pretty much figured, like we knew it wasn't right. Like we knew that the system wasn't right at the high school, but like we knew that like, hey, you can become valedictorian by taking these classes, we gamed the system in a sense.
Yeah.
And that, and now of course they've fixed it. That was before she was the principal, but now they fixed it, and it's, but that's what I'm kind of, that's what I'm talking about is if you are a person who is, has those skills that can navigate the system, you can game it in a way. But for other people, particularly creative people, I mean, like there's a lot of, I have a pretty decent balance of left brain, right brain, if you want to use that metaphor. But like a lot of the more right brain people I know, I mean, they really struggled in school because, all school does is say, learn this, spit it back out, So, I don't know. I'm sorry. I feel like I'm being really incoherent
No,
for
no,
you.
not at all.
I'm giving you like a lot of stuff.
No, this is great. So I don't know about you, but vacuuming is not one of those things that I ever look forward to doing. But as you know, your environment has a huge impact on your creativity. So I still like it to be clean wherever I'm living and working. But now it doesn't have to be something that you deal with. If you're like me and you grew up in the 80s, you probably fantasized about the day when cleaning your house would be like it was for the Jetsons, meaning you don't have to lift a finger. Well, the good news is that we're already kind of living in that future. And the easiest way to make sure your floors are clean every day is with the iRobot Roomba Robot Vacuum. It cleans up after itself. The Clean Base automatic dirt disposal takes convenience to a new level, automatically empties its own bin into an allergen lock bag that holds 60 days of debris and traps 99% of pollen, mold, and dust mites, so you can forget about vacuuming for months at a time. Let the Roomba clean for you instead. It learns your home, finds dirt, and empties itself on its own. It's got powerful cleaning performance made effortless. Remember, if it's not from iRobot, it's not a Roomba. To learn more, go to irobot.com/unmistakable. Here's something that's really interesting to me as I'm thinking about what you said. At first you have this, place where you're writing and you're creating to please other people, pleasing figures of authority. And then now you have suddenly an audience to look at. How do you maintain the balance of, keeping the integrity of your work? Because suddenly, now there's a whole other group of people who are looking at what you're doing. And I'm really interested in how you maintain that balance between those two things, because you're still writing for another group of people now. And I'm really interested in how that's changed your work.
Oh, yeah. And this is a big subject. I mean, this is really something that I've been grappling with. I have this system where I have a Tumblr that's kind of like a commonplace book where I just... anything interesting I come across, I'll blog it on the Tumblr, and then I'm a meticulous tagger. So one of my tags on Tumblr is audience. And I just have this huge, I realize that's like one of my obsessions is like, what does an artist do with an audience? Like once someone, because we have this romantic image of the artist as someone who, does stuff no matter what anyone cares about, right? Like, I'm driven to do this for myself. And if everyone else likes it, great. If not, they can go to hell or whatever, But, history has shown that there's this really interesting dance that happens once an artist becomes discovered and has an audience, and then what does the artist do with that audience, and how do they move forward? I mean, one of the most interesting examples is like someone like Radiohead. As a band, Radiohead puts their first album out. Creep is this huge single. All of a sudden, they're playing the frat boys, right? They're kind of like have this, this certain audience that they hadn't really imagined. Someone like Nirvana is even more, apt in that description. Like It Smells Like Teen Spirit comes out, and all of a sudden there are all these frat boys moshing in the mosh pit, and these are like sensitive, artistic guys, and all of a sudden they have this kind of macho audience. So like, what do? They put out In Utero, which is like it's a complete finger in the face of, it's supposed to be commercial. It's supposed to lose their audience, or at least the bad part, right? So my favorite quote that I've read on the subject is one of the very early editors of Rolling Stone when they first came out. They were just winging it, and they said at one point very early on, they said, "Holy crap, people are actually paying attention to this. Let's pretend like they're not and move forward." I've never been that way. I mean, I'm always very interested in how the audience is responding to what I'm doing. And I'm really interested in how to subvert or kind of play with that audience. And so, take Steal Like an Artist. I mean, Steal Like an Artist ended up in places that I never dreamed of. I mean, suddenly I was in. I mean, I've had everyone from, art students and creative people that's the natural audience for it, to preachers, to, army captains, just this wide grandmas, just this huge swath of people. And so, when I wrote Steal Like an Artist, I mean, I just thought it was like, this is just what I wish I had known when I was 19, and I just did a book. I found a few books in the bookstore that looked interesting, and I was like, oh, this is what you can do stylistically in a book. And like, I had a few influences of my own, and I just we made this book, And then once Steal Like an Artist came out, I saw that it was stocked in the self-help section. Which, it's like all of a sudden you're a self-help author. And I just never, at first I was like kind of repulsed, because I was like, self-help, this is disgusting. Like, I don't want to be a self-help author. Like, that's not what I'm, the punk rocker in me or whatever when I was 13, like, is totally, rolling over thinking about this. But what was really interesting then is it's like, okay, you're in this box. Instead of completely trying to shed this label, why don't we learn as much as we can about self-help? And so I kind of went on this binge of reading about the history of self-help and kind of looking into the self-help genre and like looking at the other books on the shelves and seeing what they do and what they're kind of about. And so then Show Your Work was done with that in mind. Like, Show Your Work was done with that genre in mind, that self-help genre in mind. And so Show Your Work was my attempt to, kind of to answer Steal Like an Artist, but also play with that genre of self-help, because I knew where it was going to be stocked and I knew what people responded to in that genre. And so I was just trying to play with it a little bit. Like, I think someone, like a more concrete example in that genre, like someone like Cheryl Strayed, she put out a book called Tiny Beautiful Things under, that was a column in the Rumpus called Dear Sugar. And she kind of played with that book, it's really funny because it's gotten a lot of acclaim and it deserves it because it's really great writing, but it's an advice column. It's just like what you would read in a daily newspaper, except it's intensely personal. It's what it really is it's a memoir masquerading as an advice column. And so that's the way that she's, format wise, it's an advice column, but what it really is a memoir. And that's the kind of thing I'm very interested in, is taking a genre that already exists and just kind of tweaking it or kind of playing with it, or taking a container and filling it with your own stuff. So, my books, like Steal Like an Artist and Show Your Work, they're supposed to be by the cash register in a bookstore. Like, they're what you call impulse buys. You see the cover, it hits you immediately, you flip through it, it looks cool, you buy it. But what is interesting to me is that the gift book genre is the only place that I could see. They're also really weird books, they've got illustrations and they're handwritten, and like the gift book genre just happens to be a place where I can really fire on all cylinders. That happens to be the genre where I can illustrate my own books. I could do the kind of writing I want to do, and that's, and like it works out. I'm sorry, I'm like getting away from the original question, but to me, the question is always, when you get an audience, you have a few choices. You can pretend they don't exist, which, I think you can do that, but that's not very interesting to me. You can try to alienate them so they'll go away. That's like the Nirvana approach, right? And then you can pander to them. That's artistic death, right? So I think what's really interesting is some balance in between pretending like they're not there and playing with them, and in terms of pushing them a little bit, giving them, just kind of like ratcheting things up a little bit, and kind of, pushing yourself, but also pushing your audience a little bit to come with you. Because, like, for instance, Show Your Work starts out talking about death. I mean, I wanted to, it was funny because I had a discussion with Todd Henry, who's, he writes in some of the same areas, and his last book was called Die Empty, and it had like a gas, it had like it had a little, it was like a fuel tank, and it was on empty on the cover, and it's a black cover. And, I remember him telling me, like, the publisher was just like, oh, like, you can't do this. Like, you can't die empty. Like, no one's, like, this is going to be, like, this is making us uncomfortable, But I love that idea of, let's put death right at, so like in the first section of Show Your Work, there's a spot about reading obituaries, and it has a positive spin, but I wanted to get death right on the table, and that was like my own little way of like sneaking in, this is supposed to be a positive kind of like rah, it's tough love, but it is a pep talk, but I wanted to, I like to do stuff like that, like put in a little section on death and thinking about your death, but that's what's fun to me. That's is not to shed the genre completely, but to see what you can do with it. Because I never expect, I still don't want to be a self-help author really, but like, now that, that's my, when you find yourself in the spot, it's like, well, geez, what could we do with it that would be kind of interesting, And so that's what I think, you don't necessarily get to pick your audience. You don't really know. I mean, you make what you like, and you hope that people, respond to it, or like you kind of find your own kind. But sometimes audiences show up that you're not, you're not necessarily expecting. And so for me, I want a big audience. I've never been, I grew up listening to Green Day, to me, Green Day is like, they take this form, punk rock, and, they make pop music out of it. I mean, they have a huge, broad, like massive mainstream audience, you know? And I know a lot of people turn their noses up at Green Day, but I've always looked at them and been like, man, this is so hard to pull off. It's really hard to pull off having those kind of tastes and influences and also having a mainstream audience. And to do an album like, I don't know. It's just, so it's, I've just been kind of interested in like, how can you be as ambitious as you can and go for an audience as big as you can, but also retain your taste and your own sensibilities, because I kind of think of myself as a dude who's into weird stuff, so like, how far will people go with me? And I'm also, but sometimes there's compromises, like, I'm kind of a vulgar guy. Like, I really, my dad has a filthy mouth. Like, I use a lot of or I used to before I had kids. I was always kind of had this foul mouth. I mean, that's the one thing I really got in trouble for when I was younger, is swearing and like, but now, like, I have the Christian community, like part of I don't know that you can say like there's a Christian community, but there are a lot of Christians and preachers that kind of got into Steal Like an Artist. Because if you think about it, like giving a sermon every week, that's like requires a tremendous amount of work and material and stuff. And one of the things I've noticed about my audience is there are some people who are really offended by profanity. And instead of saying, F them, I've kind of thought, well, is it essential that I swear? Is that something that's like, really important to me as a person, you know, and I think about someone like Jerry Seinfeld, who he doesn't swear because he just doesn't think it's as interesting. And so, you know, for example, like there's no profanity in Steal Like an Artist, and there's definitely none of my own profanity in Show Your Work. I think there are a few swear words from other people, but that's something that I've tamped down like consciously. Like the other week in my newsletter, I linked to there was a sign hacked in Los Angeles on the street. Someone hacked it to read, to say, read an effing book. And I linked to that, and I didn't even think about it. And I had like a lot of people write back to me like, I don't appreciate the profanity. And so, you know, and I was like, you know, that's an example where I'm like, come on, like, it wasn't me, you know, like I'm still going to celebrate stuff like that. But but that's an example of where, you know, you asked me about audience. That's an example of where I'm like, hey, there are people of all walks that read me, and I'm not trying to pander to everybody, but maybe me dropping an F-bomb, if I drop an F-bomb, that's going to turn off these people that might need to read what I have to say, but they can't get past the F-bomb, right? So is it really that important? Is it really a matter of integrity, whether I keep my foul language? I mean, as much as I love George Carlin and Richard Pryor and grew up with those, you know, like, is it really that important for me to swear in public, you know, to keep my, so that's like, you know, that's just a tiny example, but those are the little cuts that happen as an artist. You know, you're kind of, I don't, you know, you got to save something for your own life. You know, I mean, I'm always kind of like, you know, I tell people, you know, like, I've always kind of wondered if I should have had a pseudonym. I mean, I always thought Austin Kleon was a weird enough name that I didn't need a pseudonym. You know, I was like, Austin Kleon, no one else is named Austin Kleon. That's a weird name. It already sounds fake. You know, I'll just keep that. But now I kind of think like it would be interesting to have a pseudonym, so people were just a little bit more clear that like, I'm not necessarily the guy that you read in the books. You know, I mean, I'm a gentler, kinder, more helpful, non-profane version of myself in my books. You know what I mean? I mean, it's definitely me, but like the guy in the books is kinder and nicer and more helpful than I am in person. And, you know, that's what art is. I mean, that's what this stuff is about. I mean, if you can't be better than you actually are in your work, then what chance is there for anybody? You know? So anyway, that's a long-winded answer again to the question of audience.
So let's do this. Let's shift gears a little bit. Actually, there's one other question I want to ask from the beginning of this, and this is, it'll be interesting to hear your perspective. You know, you said that you never stopped drawing, and then you also had this idea that this could never happen for you. What I'm really interested in is, what do you think it is that causes people to stop, and how do you overcome that sense that it could never happen for you?
Well, I mean, for one thing, I think it's school. Going back to that subject, I mean, I think that something happens right around middle school or puberty or whatever where people become self-aware. Like young, and that's partly to do, the school part will come in a minute. But, you know, when you hang out with young kids and you ask any young kid, you know, 4 or 5 to draw you a picture, they'll just do it. Yeah. You know, and then they'll throw it out. Like, they don't care about it after they make it. You know, they're just like, they'll do it and it's done. And like, they're cool with it. But ask a 13 or a 14-year-old, you know, to draw you a picture. And, you know, some of them will do it, but a lot of them, you know, that's kind of the age where all of a sudden it's like, well, I'm not good at drawing. Like, I'm not. So I think that a couple of things happen. Like, one, I don't know what, we start labeling, Linda Berry, the cartoonist, has a beautiful essay about this comic called 2 Questions is the name of it. And, you know, she says, at what point does the question, does this suck, enter the equation? Yeah. Like, at what age do we start asking ourselves of our drawings, like, does this suck? Do I suck? Am I any good at this? You know, and I think part of that is like, you start going to school and you're getting A's, and there are people who are good at math, there are people that are good at, English, there are people that are good at art. For me in particular, I mean, there's no like, there probably is now, there's probably like a really cool cartooning class in some high schools now where like, you talk about writing and art together. But when I went to school, it's like you had art class and you had English class, and there really wasn't much in between. And so that set up itself by splitting those two subjects apart from each other. That sets you up with certain structures in your brain, and it's funny because in college I actually went to an interdisciplinary school, which the whole point of the program was to take multiple disciplines and kind of blend them back together. And so that's when I discovered, I kind of started putting pictures and words back together again. But I think that something happens with, like I said, around puberty or middle school or whatever, like you become self-aware, and all of a sudden there's ego involved in making something.
Yeah.
And I think that the people... for me, I was always praised. I mean, I obviously had some inborn talent for writing and drawing. And so I was always praised for it. And so then I didn't stop because I was like, oh, well, I'm getting praised for this.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But I wonder how many people had the gift who they never got praised for it, and then they got self-conscious about it. And that's why I think someone like Linda Berry, in some of her books, like What It Is, she's very interested in, and there's another guy named Dan Rome, whom I'm friends with, who they're very interested in bringing people back to drawing, adults, because there's a power to drawing, and it's a very, very powerful thinking tool. And so, there are problems that drawing can solve that adults don't get, they don't get access to that problem solving because they don't, I can't draw, And I also think that, something really interesting happens when I do, once in a while, I'll do a Blackout workshop for like a public audience. And this really cool thing happens when you do the Blackout poems with people, because there's very few times in our adult lives where another adult gives you a pen and some paper, or a marker and some newspapers, and says, you got 10 minutes, make me something.
Mm-hmm.
And I am just always blown away whenever a group of adults does Blackout poetry. The results are amazing. You see people, you see that concentration that comes on their faces. They look like kids again. Kids, when they're playing, people think, oh, kids playing, what a great thing. No, kids are intensely serious when they're playing. Like my son gets so frustrated and kind of zoomed in to what he's doing when he's playing. Sometimes you wonder, like, is he torturing himself? But he takes his play so seriously. He has this look of concentration when he's like pushing his cars around and stuff. And adults get that same look on their face, like when they're doing the Blackout poems. And it's probably like doing a crossword or something, but they get this in this zone of concentration. And then when they're done making the poems, they'll share them. That's the thing that really blows my mind, because like if you asked a bunch of adults to write you a poem, they would like freeze up and no one would do anything. And at the end, there might be a few like exhibitionists that would get up and read something that they'd written, but most people would stay silent. But because you're taking other people's words and you're just playing and you're destroying and, doing this kind of almost non-serious activity, even though people get really into it, they feel free up, like the things that they made were no big deal, and they'll read them, and it's kind of funny. But the power of that, just like giving people that reign again to just, hey, make us something, and taking the stakes out of it, like it doesn't have to be good. You just do something. Yeah. That if you experience that as an adult and you haven't experienced it in 20 years, it's really powerful.
Mm-hmm. No doubt. Well, let's do this. Let's shift gears a little bit and let's talk about this entire framework for how to steal like an artist, because I think it'll make a nice segue to, kind of wrapping up our conversation. how do people do that, and how do they incorporate that into their work, their art?
Well, I think a lot of people already do it. I think it's kind of a natural human impulse to kind of devour influence, to be influenced, to seek out things that respond to you or that you respond to, and to kind of wrap them up in your mind and kind of, I think a lot of people do it subconsciously. We're always taking in influence and then we forget about it. And then when we make our own work, it kind of comes out, And Steal Like an Artist is about being intentional with your influence. Like instead of just being influenced by random stuff, by actually going out and seeking, having a kind of creative kleptomania, where you're on the lookout for stuff to steal. Philip, oh gosh, what is his name? Oh, I'm blanking on his name. Philip Pullman, the guy who does The Golden Compass and those books. He says, when I'm reading, I'm looking for stuff to steal. He's like, people always ask me all the time where you get your ideas. And he's like, I steal them. And he's like, the difference between me and you is I'm on the lookout for stuff. You're not looking for it. And I think that was the point of Steal Like an Artist, is to get people in that mode of actively looking for influence and then taking that influence and saying, what from this can I take? What can I take from this, and how can I tweak it, and how can I put it together with other things I've taken and kind of transform it into my own work? What can I add? What can I subtract? And how can I transform my influences into something? So it's really about taking a process that we're all we do subconsciously anyway, but is usually pitched as a bad thing. A lot of people, like sometimes people say, when I'm writing, I don't read anything because I don't want to be influenced, and like, I'm the opposite. I mean, I'm like, I want tons of influences, and I don't want just one influence. I want 100, because if you put 100 influences together, there's another great quote: if you rip off one author, it's plagiarism. If you rip off 100 authors, it's research. It's like that idea of actively looking for influence and embracing influence instead of running away from it, and then, mashing it all up together and then transforming it into something new. That was really the point of Steal Like an Artist.
So that brings me to another question. In this world in which we're inundated with, tweets and Facebook status updates and blog posts and videos and all of this, how do you filter all this cultural influence in a way that allows you to put it back together and do what you say is finding your great work?
Yeah, man, that's a great question. To me, it's about really trying to pay attention to what's making your gut strings vibrate. Like, because there's a lot, if you're hooked up to Twitter all day or you're reading the blogs and stuff, you've been online, it's like an echo chamber, people are constantly like just kind of, passing, and I'm as guilty of it as anyone else. People are constantly passing around the same links, and they're looking at the same art, and you can even see it with illustrators, like one style will become very, everybody's into this style now. Everyone's into flat design this week, and everything looks a certain way. And so I think that part of the, I think there's nothing wrong with, being connected and being influenced. But I think, a lot of being unique or kind of attempting some sort of originality is really more about the kind of going deep and finding the kind of, seeking out influences that other people don't have necessarily, So I think of someone like Quentin Tarantino. Quentin Tarantino is like one of my favorite examples of this, because this is a guy who has obviously, spent about, 10 years just watching movies in like working in a video store and just watching an insane amount of movies, you know? And so his knowledge is encyclopedic. He knows the blockbusters, he knows the Oscar winners, the mainstream movies, but he also knows all the weird kung fu movies and westerns and bizarre out there films, you know? And a lot of what Tarantino does is he takes these, you know, art forms that, you know, not a lot of people are looking at, and that's what he kind of, you know, he takes these references and builds them up into something that a mainstream audience can appreciate. You know, and so to me it's like a lot of times you know, you have to kind of, I think you have to seek out other avenues and ways of discovering things. So, you know, that's why I think, you know, something as old-fashioned as going to a library and just kind of wandering the stacks and bumping into books you'd never, you know, no one would ever point to online, you know, that kind of thing, or traveling somewhere new or interesting, you know, or just looking at material that most people don't consider decent fodder for art. You know, I got interested recently in a woman named Corita Kent, who was she was a really fabulous screen printer and artist, but she was also a nun. And she was really into, and like this is in the 60s and 70s, she was really into stealing like advertising and like billboards and all sorts of stuff around Los Angeles. She would take this type and these slogans and stuff, and she would tweak them into a religious context. And she did all these really beautiful screen prints using like she'd take she was kind of Andy Warholish in the way that she'd take like a bag of Wonder Bread, you know, and she'd break the elements apart and she would bring out the religious context of Wonder Bread. You know, because if you think about like Christianity and the Bible, like bread has a very distinct meaning, and like the idea of Wonder Bread, you know, she would do that kind of weird stuff. But like no one at that time thought that advertising was ripe for, you know, making art, let alone religious art, you know? So that's the kind of thing that you think, you have to kind of think like, well, where the first part is kind of knowing where everyone else is looking, and then kind of discovering what people aren't looking at, you know, and sometimes that's the way that you can really find your niche or your uniqueness, or if you want to call it originality. You know? Well,
you know, I'm going to use this opportunity for a shameless plug for a new project that we've just launched called unmistakableposters.com. And, you know, what's interesting is it came about through a very similar process. You know, I looked at the fact that I could write certain things, but I couldn't illustrate. And of course, you know, everybody knows that we work with this amazing illustrator named Sarah Steenland. And I'd written this post called The 15 Principles of an Unmistakable Standard. And I said, hey, can you take a stab at illustrating this? And what came out was something that we could put up for sale as a poster.
Cool.
And we would have never predicted that just because we're blending different art forms.
Yeah. And so, you know, it's like and this is basically creative to me. You know, people ask me, I'm like a creativity guy now, which I never expected, but it's like, you know, people ask me for my definition of creativity, and like the best thing I can come up with is you take things that are in the world and you put them together into something that didn't previously exist. So it's like, with that as your definition of creativity, creativity can be putting the ingredients together to bake a loaf of bread. You know, it can be sewing a dress. It can be, you know, building an air filter on a spaceship when you need one, you know, Apollo 13 style. Yeah. Or it can be painting a picture, you know? And so creativity is just a tool that you use to do stuff, you know? So like, you know, if you want to be a better writer, you know, sometimes creativity helps, sometimes not being creative helps, you know, and yeah, I think it's just, for me, a very basic creativity is just taking two things that no one really thought of putting together and putting them together and seeing what they do.
Awesome. Well, hey, Austin, I want to wrap with my final question, which is how we close all our interviews here at The Unmistakable Creative. What do you think it is that makes somebody or something unmistakable?
Oh, you know, unmistakable. Gosh, I feel like one of my favorite quotes recently has been like, Hitchcock said, style is self-plagiarism. And I feel like there's something, I almost think that that you've hit your style, or that you've hit that thing that you do almost when it becomes easily emulatable. Like Wes Anderson is someone that everyone's always doing a Wes Anderson parody, and that's because he's hit on something that's so uniquely his that people know what that's like to be a Wes Anderson, So I almost think in some ways, you're unmistakable almost when the world doesn't need you anymore. You've created something that like people say, oh yeah, we get it, and they finally bring it in. I don't know what that means business wise, but I don't know. That's probably that was my that's my softball lob of an answer. I don't know. Unmistakable. That's such an interesting word.
Yeah.
I didn't think about that.
Well, hey, Austin, it's been my absolute pleasure to have you here as a guest on the Unmistakable Creative. Like I said, you've been long requested, so I'm really glad that we finally got a chance to have you here, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join us. I
hope I haven't disappointed everyone.
No worries.
And I was very pleased to be asked, and thanks so much.
Yeah, and for those of you guys listening, we will wrap the show with that. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. While you were listening, were there any moments you found fascinating, inspiring, instructive, maybe even heartwarming? Can you think of anyone, a friend or a family member who would appreciate this moment? If so, take a second and share today's episode with that one person, because good ideas and messages are meant to be shared.